The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together, without coercion or conscription, bullying or bossiness.
Always whenever someone says, oh, peace and sausage, and it's a roll and sausage, and it's sausage roll, we're better together.
Well, they didn't. It was us. We invented it, just like every other bloody thing.
Well, that's very interesting.
We have very serious the referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, if you've been fed up with most of the debate until now, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland. Hello, welcome to Scottish Independence Podcast number 12, and this time our guest is Patrick Harvie. Patrick is the co-convenor of the Scottish Green Party and an MSP. We talked about why the Green Party's decided to join the Yes campaign and many other things besides, so we'll just get right to the conversation and I hope you enjoy it. There'll be a couple of little announcements at the end. So hello, welcome to Scottish Independence Podcast number 12, and this time I'm delighted to say our guest is Patrick Harvie, who's joining us on this momentous day when the oil industry's completed the hostile takeover of the Church of England. Though, given it was the Church of England, I'm sure it was done over tea and scones. So, Patrick, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fine. The first thing I'm supposed to ask you is the Green Party's recently gone for joining the Indy campaign, the Yes campaign, even though there were some reservations before. So would you like to tell me on the party level why the decision was made to become part of the Yes campaign?
Sure. Well, as long as I've been a member of the Scottish Green Party, whenever the question of independence has gone to our party conference, there's been broad debate. There's been usually a vote somewhere in the region of 2-1 in favour. And then we've hugely failed to fall out about it because as a movement, as a political party, we're brought together by a different set of issues. So we're pretty relaxed about having a range of views about independence within the party. But we have always had this balance in favour of independence. And so we were open to being part of Yes Scotland when it was set up. And we're quite positive about the idea of finally putting this question to the public in a single issue referendum. So when the Yes Scotland movement was set up, we were happy to be invited along to take part in the launch. But we made it pretty clear that it was going to have to evolve rapidly into something that was genuinely cross-party. Because it was established by the SNP, all the staff were appointed by the SNP, the timing and the content of the launch was decided by the SNP. That's understandable. They're the dominant party on the pro-independence side, and it's in many ways, well, very clearly, their political mandate from following the last election on which the referendum's happening. But if the campaign's going to reach beyond the people who've ever voted SNP, and that's what it has to achieve if it's going to get a majority, then it had to become a broader cross-party and non-party campaign. Now, there were some early teething troubles there, and it didn't happen on the pace that we had wanted and expected. So we had to make some of those criticisms in private and in public. Over the summer months, though, progress did happen. And what you've got now is a body that's got an advisory board that obviously, yes, it includes the SNP, but it's not dominated by them. You've got a staff team that includes the SNP, but isn't dominated by them as well. And I think you've got an agenda for the organisation, for the campaign going forward, that will be pretty inclusive. So we took it to our party conference and we had a very good debate. And I think this time we got, it must have been about 80% plus. It was a very, very strong positive support at our conference this year for joining Yes Scotland. It's not a change to our policy. It's simply a question of how we campaign, how we position ourselves in the referendum campaign. And we will be looking to put forward a very distinctive policy stance, a green analysis on the questions of why Scotland should be independent and what we could do with independence. So we won't be aping the SNP, but we'll be working together with them and others who want to support a yes vote.
That's excellent, because I was going to come to, what for green issues, what could independence do for Scotland? What would we be allowed to do that we're not able to do at the moment? What levers of control would we have in order to improve or help the environmental situation that we don't have at the moment? Sorry.
Sure. Well, there have always been problems with the current devolution settlement, and whether somebody has a kind of identity nationalism or not. The current settlement is problematic. We've got responsibility for a lot of the consequences of problems without being able to do anything about the causes. So we've got responsibility on something like fuel poverty, but we can't do anything to regulate the energy market. We've got responsibility for dealing with, the effects of poverty and homelessness and debt and so on, but we can't take the economic or tax and benefit decisions that are needed to try and solve those problems. So the Scottish Parliament has to deal with some of the consequences, but it can't get involved in the causes of some of the structural inequalities, for example, in our society. So, whether you're instinctively, emotionally pro-independence or not, there's a problem with the current setup. If you think about something like the energy situation, we need a transformation of our energy system to not just move us away from fossil fuels and onto renewables, and to break the link that everybody's so dependent on a handful of big energy companies when we could be much more empowered if we thought about who owns energy, decentralized ownership of the energy system, but also reducing demand. We're going to have to move, all countries around the world are going to have to move away from this sense that energy is a cheap commodity and it can just be used in abundance. Energy in the future is going to be an increasingly expensive commodity, and we're going to have to use less of it. So shifting away from fossil fuels and nuclear, breaking the link with the multinationals, and also reducing our demand. Those need to be the priorities. And the context in Scotland is so different. Our housing stock is very different when you think about energy demand. Our industries are different. Our resources are different. The vast renewable resource that we have, whereas our energy decisions are being taken by ministers in London from whichever part of the country they represent as MPs. They're making decisions on behalf of the whole of the UK, and they're going to be focused on some of the big industrial scale solutions like nuclear power for the south of England. And our interests on energy issues are being represented in Europe by those ministers who don't have a specifically Scottish perspective.
And we're also seriously underrepresented in Europe.
Absolutely. Scotland's interests are absolutely tied to a European subsea grid, getting the ability to export and import electricity efficiently across the North Sea to our neighbours, as well as down south and in the other direction to Ireland. That European electrical grid, a European supergrid, is absolutely vital if we want to have a high penetration of renewables, because if you have a high penetration of renewables, there are different intermittent sources. Now, that's not an impossible problem to solve, but it requires a really good grid connection, and it requires storage as well. Now, that grid connection is going to be a mammoth project, and it's going to have to be funded and coordinated at a European level. Scotland has a profound interest in seeing that pushed forward, so that when we get our wave and tidal power onto the grid in the 2020s, we're able to get the maximum benefit from it. Benefit in terms of the energy system domestically, but also economic benefit through imports and exports. That's something that we absolutely have to see happen. And I'm just not convinced that it's going to be top of the list for any UK energy minister. It's on their agenda. They're not doing nothing, but they're not giving it the priority that Scotland needs to see it given.
Okay, and do you think this is something I discussed in the first episode of this? I spoke to a teacher at Cambridge University, Donald Adamson, who writes for a couple of Scottish websites as well. And we talked about, in some ways, at the heart of some of the SNP rhetoric. I don't want to get into politicking here, but there's a kind of there's a little bit of a contradiction sometimes in that they say they're going to push the green agenda, but at the same time they say we're going to be rich because of the oil.
Yes.
And there's kind of a bit of a problem with that. I'm sure you see it as well.
Absolutely. The SNP are good on renewables. The previous Labour Lib Dem administration saw the opportunity from renewables as well, but the SNP have accelerated the drive toward renewables, and that's great. That's wonderful. And the consistency of support that they're giving by setting long-term targets for deployment of renewables, that's fantastic. But if you look at the other side of the coin, they're also, Fergus Ewing only really gets the glee in his eyes when he starts talking about another 50 years of oil and gas extraction. So they're running a high carbon, low carbon energy policy. Now, my objective is to shift from one to the other, shift away from those fossil fuel resources and onto a different set of energy resources in energy terms and economic terms. And so I would like to be thinking that we can say how much of that oil and gas can we afford to extract? Because when you take fossil carbon out of the ground, it'll end up in the atmosphere, and we need to take responsibility for that by using less of it and extracting less of it. How much of that can we afford to extract in environmental terms? What are the ecological limits that we're not willing to cross? And then of the amount that we can extract, how can we best turn that into an economic asset to develop renewables? And I'd love to see that developed in the public sector as well. There is a need for private sector investment in renewables, but some of the companies are actually public sector companies. They're just owned by other countries' governments. Now, why couldn't we see the opportunity of developing a public sector, a publicly owned renewable energy company for Scotland? We could do it at local level right now without additional powers. But if we had the powers of independence and the revenue from the fossil fuel reserves, as we see that on a declining basis, we've got that revenue, we can invest it into building an asset that would be creating income for generations to come, not just a few decades. So, there's an extent to which, I criticise the SNP for some of the things they're not doing at the moment, like empowering councils to set up local energy companies right now and reducing demand for fossil fuels. But with the powers of independence, there's a great deal more that could be done, both in terms of the engineering and the economics, but also the long-term transition away from fossil fuels.
Also politically, in the framework of United Kingdom's version of neoliberal capitalism and the parties that represent that, with New Labour and Conservative, and the Liberals obviously, in the UK framework it'd be far more difficult to do anything, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, this is a difficult discussion that I have sometimes with my Green colleagues south of the border, because they support our position on Scottish independence. They recognise it's something that creates real opportunities for Scotland, but they're trying to argue the case for pretty fundamental changes in the UK, and in many ways it's hard to see the UK being capable of that level of political change. But the last thing I want is to vote yes in 2014 in order to swap UK neoliberalism for Scottish neoliberalism. And so I get very, very worried when I hear John Swinney and Alex Salmond, courting tax exiles and trying to get them to back up their policies on things like slashing corporation tax. We need to be closing down tax loopholes. We need to be setting the tone right now, as John Swinney's setting up Revenue Scotland to start looking at existing and potential future taxation powers, even under the recent Scotland Act. Even if, before we think about what happens after 2014, we've got to start thinking about using existing and, nearly upon us tax powers in a way that shuts down those tax loopholes and makes sure that the wealthy pay their share, instead of courting their support by all this kind of Scotland's open for business kind of rhetoric.
Since we're into the politics side of it, in the Parliament, just something I'd be interested to know about, I think a lot of people would be, outside of what we jokingly called last week Prime Minister's, First Minister's quotations instead of First Minister's questions, because it just seems that they're quoting people back and forward at each other now. Outside of when the cameras are on, are people actually talking about the referendum, or are they more talking about the usual stuff, how to score points off the other party, or more day-to-day things about running the country?
Yeah. I think it's quite strange at the moment. The atmosphere is quite odd. There is always more in the way of cross-party cooperation than a lot of people imagine. Things like some of the subject committees that are dealing with issues around health, education, housing, all of those vital issues, as well as the cross-party groups, which are not on the record. They're more informal sort of networking exercises for MSPs and external organisations who want to talk to us about issues. Whether that's, again, a whole host of different issues. I'm involved in cross-party group on food, cross-party group on sexual health, a few others. That kind of level of day-to-day cooperation does happen across party lines, and it's still happening. But the more you get close to anything that's got profile, an issue that's got political profile, media profile, or certainly, set-piece debates like First Minister's questions, the more it becomes really aggressive and really quite depressingly so. I think what we need is a constructive debate over the next 2 years. I really want to hear from both sides, from the No campaign as well, positive ideas about changing Scotland for the better. I want to hear this debate conducted at the highest possible level. And I fear that some people have decided that if they just keep it shallow and aggressive, they'll scare people into away from changing their mind, because it's the yes side